Pawn e2 to e4.
Pawn e7 to e5.
Knight g1 to f3.
Knight b8 to c6.
Bishop f1 to b5.
Pawn a7 to a6.
Bishop b5 takes c6.
Pawn d7 takes c6.
Pawn d2 to d4.
Pawn e5 takes d4.
Queen d1 takes d4.
Queen d8 takes d4.
Knight f3 takes d4.
Bishop f8 to d6.
Knight b1 to c3.
Knight g8 to e7.
Bishop c1 to e3.
Castle kingside.
Castle kingside.
Rook f8 to e8.
Rook a1 to d1.
Pawn c6 to c5.
Knight d4 to e2.
Pawn b7 to b6.
Rook d1 to d2.
Knight e7 to c6.
Bishop e3 to f4.
Bishop d6 takes f4.
Knight e2 takes f4.
Knight c6 to d4.
Knight f4 to d5.
Rook a8 to a7.
Knight d5 to e3.
Pawn b6 to b5.
Rook f1 to d1.
Bishop c8 to b7.
Pawn f2 to f3.
Pawn b5 to b4.
Knight c3 to d5.
Bishop e7 takes d5.
Knight e3 takes d5.
Pawn c7 to c6.
Knight d5 to e3.
Rook a7 to e7.
Pawn c2 to c3.
Pawn b4 takes c3.
Pawn b2 takes c3.
Knight e4 to b5.
Rook d2 to d3.
Rook e7 to e6.
Pawn a2 to a4.
Knight b5 to a7.
Rook d3 to d7.
Knight a7 to c8.
Pawn a4 to a5.
Rook e8 to f8.
Knight e3 to c4.
Knight c8 to e7.
Rook d7 to a7.
Knight e7 to g6.
Rook a7 takes a6.
Rook f8 to b8.
Rook a6 to b6.
Rook b8 to a8.
Rook d1 to d7.
Knight g6 to f4.
King g1 to f1.
Knight f4 to g6.
Pawn a5 to a6.
Knight g6 to f8.
Rook d7 to c7.
Rook e6 to e8.
Knight c4 to d6.
Rook e8 to d8.
Rook b6 takes c6.
Knight f8 to e6.
Rook c7 to b7.
Pawn f7 to f6.
Pawn a6 to a7.
Knight e6 to f4.
Knight d6 to f5.
King g8 to h8.
Knight f5 takes g7.
Rook d8 to g8.
Knight g7 to f5.
Rook g8 to d8.
Knight f5 to h6.
Rook d8 to d1.
King f1 to f2.
Rook d1 to c1.
Rook c6 to c7.
Rook c1 to c2.
King f2 to g3.
Rook a8 to g8.
King g3 takes f4.
Rook g8 to g4.
Knight h6 takes g4.
Rook c2 to d2.
Pawn a7 to a8, promoting to queen.
Rook d2 to d8.
Queen a8 takes d8, checkmate.